An introduction to the calendar. In the universe of Yulim, the dates are split into two different classifications, Old Age and New Age. This dating system was popularized from N9.999 and 16.999 by the Mensekinder Ophalad. It is known as Orbusk Standard. There are 20 months, called Quint, in the Orbuscan year, called a kilo fraction: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, Sipan, Alora, Opharian, Ulysses, Keros, Unio, Romeo, and Pegasus. Each quint has 50 tempo fractions, or just tempos for short. Each one is roughly 5 hours long. Weeks are still called weeks, but they have 10 days instead of 7. For that matter, any measurement of time that is lower than a tempo's, hours, minutes, seconds, are the same length and are called the same name as usual. It operates like our BC and AD. The event that separated the Old Age and New Age was the unification of various states in the galaxy into the first Shurnara of Sapiens, and at the same time the creation of the eternal soul of Tabarish. By the end of the decade, Mense-Prime had become a paradise world for the Kadeshi. Its mangroves, jungles, and swamps had swollen to massive proportions, allowing the population of the Kadeshi to increase into the hundreds of billions. They began to slowly terraform and build habitats around the other worlds of the system, including Orville, which had been abandoned to the Kadeshi of the time, previously unknown inhabitants. By the N9.300s, the full system was colonized by the Kadeshi. But there was a problem: the children of the Ep3 were coming home. First of all, however, we have to cover what they were up to in between their exodus of Orville and their arrival home. In the year N9.099, the Ep3 once again boarded a ship, St. Tempest's Sorrow, an enormous 642-kilometer ship that uses the bones of the Junipist fetus as its own skeleton, and left the system. Through their journey, different factions of the children of the Ep3 broke off from the main ship, entering different solar systems to colonize them and bring them under Kodo, children of the Ep3 control. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of Kodo colonies were made from N9.099, N9.300. Not all of them were connected, most of them didn't fancy each other too much. Each individual colony had a different idea of what their god, whose name is Kvelahzieb, pronounced Kvelahasib. He is the god of technology, the keeper of the flare abyss, and the god of the ancestors. It is said that he is the amalgamation between the essence of the flare abyss, the spirit forges of the immaterial plane, another name for the flare abyss, and the souls of all Kodo past. For example, when a child of the Ep3 dies, instead of saying rest in peace, the Forge Fear would say may your code empower Kvelahzieb, or just my Kvelahzieb, wanted. The only thing that tied them all together was their shared insignia. The code and technological implants represent their shared reverence of technology, the skull represents their humanity. The fact that the technology is placed over the top of the skull represents how the Kodo have conquered their biology through technology. And finally, the large black shape on the forehead of the skull represents an SKT, just without its signature rainbow glow, and the Epsiotech contained inside. But there was something they wanted. They wanted it desperately. Their home system, Mense-Prime. So, from N9.304, N9.308, the children of the Ep3 prepared the Mense Jihad. Kodo Vanguard forces first arrived in the system in N9.309. They scouted the current state of the system. They saw how the Kadeshi had colonized every planet and had industrialized the asteroid belts and gas giants of the system. Their first encounter with Kadeshi was on their previous homeworld of Orville. A scout ship touched down on a relatively desolate area and immediately sent out Roborg scout drones and underground monitorium drones. These probes gathered invaluable information on the toadish Christmas beetles that now controlled the system. Soon, the first warships would arrive. Thousands of ships began to colonize the Mensort cloud with industry. Factories were built on every asteroid and planetoid. The expansion radiated out in an exponential wave. This military maneuver was a common one employed by the children of the Ep3. Called the Thaurkon technique, it was developed by St. Lou Thaurkon and is an incredibly effective mass invasion technique. The Kodo fleet that had arrived consisted of thousands of ships originally. But after the Thaurkon technique, the fleet had increased to an unfathomable 20 million. Most of the ships themselves were only small woodcraft, merely hollowed-out asteroids with a life support system and 6 medium Mk-42, 42. Bolt cannons. Oid craft are on average no less than a few dozen meters long. But there were other types of ships. Things like Ghibli Yesenarchio barges, Ep3-class Stardius carriers, and the Stardius Mk8 destroyers themselves, Shaunex Bellum barges, and St. Jolly's Zergoff dreadnoughts. Officially the invasion of the Mense system began on N9.313. But by the time that the Mensord cloud was converted into the Zax shell fleet as it was known, the war was already virtually won. The first places to fall were the system's outer monitoring stations. Things like anneal cylinders, agri platforms, extrasolar traffic beacon arrays, ECT, were swiftly taken over, further fueling the war effort with food, bonus supplies, and, unfortunately for the inhabitants of said habitats, soldiers. The next frontier of the war was upon Orville. At first, they pinged the governor of the world. Kodo forces gave them the option to stand down, but the governor refused, shooting 1,646 Mk99 new atomic artillery cannons at the visible fleet. It caused millions of casualties and the destruction of 1,000 ships. The corpses of those same ships began to fall to the surface of the world, their millions of shattered parts heating up the atmosphere, and thusly the world too. The rest of the ships began to pelt the world with millions of tiny bombs, all hitting the world at 3 to 4% the speed of light, detonating on impact. That first, 3-minute strike killed 25 million people and destroyed industry uncountable. The admiral of the Orville branch of the fleet commanded his E-Warfare Brigade to hack into the Orville retrocortex. It appeared that the Kadeshi of the world had used a hybrid of the old Kodo code, infrastructure and their own. So it was an easy feat to hack into their systems. On the 49th of Ulysses, N9.314, this message was broadcast across all Omnivisions, retinizers, and retrocortexes around the world. Dear citizens of Orville, we are the children of the Ipsiotechniat, the previous inhabitants of this world. This world is our birthright, and we will acquire it once again, either through peace or violence. So we implore you, give up, do not fight our conquest. And we warn you, if you resist for any longer, you will suffer the terminal consequences. End communication _ middle. Admiral Killy 1001 Eratas. In the following tempos riots, strikes, and even minor rebellions broke out across the world. But still the governor did not retreat, didn't surrender. In the sky, if you were on the right side of the planet of course, you would be able to see the Navy in the sky parting. And in its place was a superweapon of caliber not seen in eons. The massive structure took the form of a 16-pointed star, made completely out of some strange yellow metal. In the center of the star there was an intricately manufactured black shape welded onto the front. Looking from the ground it seemed it had to be hundreds of kilometers across. Suddenly, from each point of the star, green beams began to fire. At the same time the structure began to turn on its side, pointing the beams at the world. As soon as the beams hit the world, they exploded with the power of a nuclear bomb going off each second. Then the superweapon began to spin. The beams tore across the world at breakneck speeds, instantly annihilating entire cities and killing hundreds of thousands every minute. The vile neon beams viciously pummeled Orville for tempos. The heat, and radiation, spreading across the world. After 13 tempos the world, now without their governor, surrendered. After that the beams stopped. As the people of the world would later find out, the beams were made of superheated radium which was sped up to hundreds of thousands of kilometers per hour. The beams not only destroyed the industry and habitability of the world in the present, but for tens of thousands of years to come. Kodo experts calculated that it would be roughly the year N29.314 until Orville would fully shed its radioactivity. However, even if the world of Orville was now retaken, what could the Kodo do with it? It was irradiated out of its mind and leveled to the ground. But like always, the children of the Ipsiotechniat came up with a solution. Since the majority of them were still at least partially human, the solution came from the surgeries of the Genio Ipsiotechniat. It was called fungi merging and consisted of the human elements of individual Kodo artisans being merged with radiotrophic fungi, giving them the ability to feed off of the background radiation of any world they have leveled. It was from that radioactive leveling of Orville that the children of the Ipsiotechniat, and later the grandchildren, would acquire their signature, and predominant, yellow and black color scheme. The next world on the warpath was the gas giant Urialteth and its moons, the Seven Sister Strongholds, SSSI through 7 respectively. Whilst the First Fleet, The Orville fleet was busy bathing Orville in radiation. The Ural-Tethan fleet was fighting a vicious war in the Ural-Tethan SSS orbital system. Tens of millions of combatants fought in the void of space. The atmospheres of the gas giant and the fortress moons, and the surfaces of those same bodies. There were hundreds of separate battles that were fought over roughly 10 months, but there are only 4 that will be covered in depth here. The first was the last stand of Captain Jarek and his Pantheon crew. It begun with the encirclement of the St. Pietro subfleet and its subsequent placement into an expandable hammerspace projector. For those who don't know, hammerspace is basically a pocket dimension anywhere from the size of the room to, at the largest, 1 astronomical unit wide. They are used in a military sense to trap enemy vessels and attacking forces so that they can be destroyed in a more controlled environment. The main ship in the subfleet was called St. Pietro's Bacchanal and measured in at over 4.2 kilometers long. It was flanked by thousands of smaller cruisers, weapons platforms, and oid craft. St. Pietro's Bacchanal itself had a crew complement of 489,000, whilst the entire fleet combined was over 1 million. Once the subfleet was in hammerspace, millions of strike drones, little probes no bigger than 12 meters, were sent into the pocket dimension. The first wave of the battle lasted dozens of days and ended in a victory for Captain Jarek, the leader of the subfleet. In the following months, the million men and women of the St. Pietro Bacchanal flew their ships together, docking them all in, out, and between each other, creating a massive makeshift habitat. In this habitat, people went about their lives, farming, building, working, and defending. Every few weeks the people would armor up and fight to defend their new home, which was co-equally known as St. Pietro's Hold. All the while trying to find a way out of the hammerspace they found themselves in. A solution was found in the form of an FTL cannon that would shoot a lone messenger drone back out into real space through the minuscule hole the probes left when entering the hammerspace. It would then seek out and alert the closest children of the Ipsiotechnian vessel to the situation the St. Pietro Bacchanal found itself in. So, when the next attack came on the 39th of Pegasus N9.314, the cannon was prepared. As soon as the swarm of drones poured into the pocket dimension, Captain Jarek himself fired the cannon. A wide arc of light poured out of the cannon at physics-breaking speeds. Unfortunately, however, a distress message sent through the drone's entry point was never meant to be. As soon as the beam made contact with the entry point, the entirety of the hammerspace subdimension was engulfed in a blinding white light that quickly set ablaze with green and purple flame. Physics in the pocket dimension itself began to break down. People who had grown to 2 or 3 times their normal size fought dozens of drones at a time alongside others who had become beings of pure laser or 8-headed bird creatures. Large rifts in the fabric of the dimension started to work their way through the hammerspace's tapestry, exposing the flare abyss in which this artificial dimension was situated. Imps and demons began to flood into the space and fight the drones and crew alike. Captain Jarek himself became a 40-armed creature which had fused with an oid craft. His 20 white flaming eyes were situated on each vertex of his now dodecahedral head. His body was a mishmash of oid craft components and members of the crew. His new hulking form stood at roughly 36 meters tall. But the drones too had suffered a strange fate in this rapidly decaying sub-realm. A mass of them had formed into a large clump of drony mass. It constantly vomited a host of multicolored lasers, missiles, and bullets from every one of its thousands of weapons bays. It was roughly 45 meters in diameter. The mass itself glowed with an intense brightness and burnt with a clear flame. On each pole, north and south, of the entity speakers emerged, distortedly screaming the name Meluzabub. It could only be inferred that this was the creature's new name. The now lumbering form of Captain Jarek and the sphere of Meluzabub fought against each other in a legendary battle whilst millions of corrupted drones, mutant crew, and malicious demons fought, killed, and died around them. To some, the last stand of Captain Jarek and his Pantheon crew lasted mere minutes, and to others the orgy of unhinged violence lasted decades. However, no matter how long it lasted, the ending is always the same. St. Pietro's Hold, Captain Jarek, and his valiant crew lost. But no matter how much time passes, the last stand of Captain Jarek and his Pantheon crew will never be forgotten. The second battle was more of a small-scale war fought around and upon the moon of SSSV. Nicknamed the Armageddon War of a Stronghold's Titanfall. The battle started with the glassing team breaking through the defenses of the stronghold moon of SSSV. As soon as the glassing ships made it into orbit, they let loose, firing their beams which glowed with a superheated, hyperspeed ichor. The pillars of light made their way down to the planet in fractions of a second. Yet, nothing else happened. No characteristic tidal wave of light radiating out from the contact point. Nothing. It wasn't until about 15 seconds later that the crew of the glassing team vessels would find out why. With the same speed and intensity, the beams would shoot back up from the surface of the world, perfectly hitting each one of the ships, destroying them instantly. When the team didn't return home in the next few days, the larger Ural-Tethan fleet became suspicious. When a regiment of spy drones were sent to the last known location of the glassing team. When the drones arrived, they saw the remnant of the battle and the carcasses of the ships. Quickly, they pinged the larger fleet to the state of the glassing team and requested an immediate redeployment of ships, troops, and weapons platforms. However, the drones had another task. Now that they had found the remains of the battle, it had to be figured out why. Why had the ships lost what was seemingly an already won battle? In the burnout hull of one of the ships, a data core was found and analyzed. The drones now knew about the strange reflection of the beams of light. They transmitted everything on the data core to a close children of the Ep3 station for further inspection. Luckily, the ship's outer cameras were recording at the time of the beam reflection and managed to capture a strange anomaly on the surface of the moon. An artisan of the Kodo managed to spot this anomaly and reported it to his higher-ups. Those higher-ups ordered the redeployment fleet, which had been assigned to SSSV, to record and relay everything they saw on the surface of the world. From these innumerable hours of recording, Kodo forces were able to piece together that this anomaly on the surface of the moon was a Mecha-Titan. Now they had seen Mecha-Titans before, heck, they had even built thousands of them. But nothing like this. It was estimated that this mount was over 1.7 kilometers tall, dwarfing the tallest mount that the Kodo could build. That being St. Tulantau's Mecha class, clocking in at around 1,022 meters tall. It seemed that this mount was somehow able to absorb, channel, and fire back any gun or laser fire that was shot at it. The only way forward for the Kodo was to deploy Mecha-Titans of their own. It was on New Year's Eve of N9.314 that the MTs were deployed. Falling from orbit, they hit the ground with astonishing force, causing earthquakes and tornadoes in the surrounding areas. The force that was deployed was made up of 16 St. Tulantaus, 18 Zarek Yulim 4s, which clocked in at 800 meters tall, and 40 Miscanbellos, which stood at about 120 meters tall. Fighting raged across the surface of the world as natural disasters collided with hundreds of thousands of little fighter jets, which themselves swarmed around the great and terrible battle between Mecha-Titans, which rivaled ancient prophecies about the end of the world from long-forgotten times. The behemoths traded punches, stabs, saws, laser, and gunfire. It seemed, however, that this hulking titan of a mythical age, whose smooth white and purple body juxtaposed the large, dark gray, very brutalist forms of the Mecha-Titans, had not just the ability to absorb energy, but matter too. MTs that had physical contact with the gargantuan Mecha-Titan, who had been dubbed the Maskranda Large, would slowly stop fighting and begin to turn on their allies, merging as one into the creature Titan. Their bodies being covered with sickly white and purple veins. Eventually, after fighting for an hour or two, the entire 74-part force of Mecha-Titans had unconsensually been merged into one, with the Maskranda Large at the helm. It seemed that nothing could be done to stop this creature, this thing. However, one man had a vision of a final solution. One that was just as crazy as the Maskranda Large itself. The plan went something like this. The 16-pointed vessel of the Reaper, the megastructure that was used to annihilate resistance on Orville months earlier, was to be placed in the center of a megastructure built around the star of the Mense system. This megastructure would take advantage of the already existing infrastructure around the stellar object and hybridize it with Kodo upgrades suited for this plan. The 16-pointed vessel of the Reaper was to be basically an ultra-radioactive magnifying glass for this advanced nickel Dyson beam. The hyperweapon would then be fired at the moon, engulfing the entire thing in one pillar of death. To see this plan to fruition in a reasonable span of time, the Kodo released an infinitely dangerous yet extremely effective grey goo-like hive mind to work upon the star. Using these nanobots, the Kodo forces managed to finish the weapon in a matter of months. The shot was lined up, all systems were activated, and the weapon fired. It was said that you could see a green glow emerge from the system even from interstellar space. For the minute that it fired, the system stood still to marvel at this feat of destructive giga engineering. It seemed that the weapon did the trick, however. The creature wasn't seen again. For a few thousand years, that was. but at this point that the Kodo had no way of knowing its ultimate fate. But there was a problem. The beam was much more powerful than anticipated. Yes, it annihilated SSSV, but it did much more than that. The gas giant itself, Urialtith, was set ablaze. A morbidly beautiful sight to behold indeed. Which leads on to the next battle. The third battle we'll be touching on picks up right after the second one and was called the Shattered Hunger of the Bellow Cities. There had been a war raging in the thick stormy atmosphere and on the solid metal core of the gas giant Urialtith itself. The war was turning in the favor of the Kadeshi as the children of the Ep3, strong as they were only able to break through the planetary defenses irregularly. So the Kodo force on the planet was limited to small numbers. However, that all changed when the 16-pointed vessel of the Reaper fired its cannon at SSSV and subsequently Urialtith, setting the blanket ablaze. The majority of the Kadeshi fighting force on world was self-supplied. Sky farms and mines under the metallic surface were used to supply the world's defending force. And when the beam fired, taking a chunk out of the gaseous world and igniting the rest, it also destroyed the majority of the infrastructure on the world, rendering the defending force, as well as the attacking force on a timeline of months. However, the attacking Kodo artisans had an advantage. After constructing and firing their new hyper-weapon, a large portion of the Kadeshi had broken off from the whole, a civil war of sorts. They were called the Kadeshi Peace Interplanetary, or KPI for short, and they fought against the greater Kadeshi society as a whole. First peacefully through protests, but after that method failed through forceful means. To bring peace to the system and sign an unconditional surrender with the children of the Ep3. In turn, these movements across the system allowed the Kodo to supply their forces on Urialtith. To be fair, the frequency of these resupplies was few and far between at best. But it was still better than the Kadeshi, who were now trapped on the surface of the world. Stuck underground, trapped between hurricane force firestorms and debris hail from the remnants of unseen battles overhead. The Kodo and Kadeshi similarly constructed underground buildings, tunnels, bases, and more to house and supply their dwindling populations, made up entirely of soldiers. Massive sprawling tunnel complexes would be made, hoping to find resources and the enemy alike. When enemies were encountered, the tunnels would transform into war zones. The same material that was collected from boring into them was used to construct weapons of war which would eventually clog up the tunnels, sealing them off until another intrepid explorer or brave warrior decided to excavate them once again. The tombs that were constructed were many things, but least of all farms. So as a result of this, when food inevitably ran out, infighting broke out. Thousands of people fractured into hundreds of different food gangs, patrolling the underground tunnels and abandoned bunkers for any scraps of food, and eventually the enemy. The hunger became so bad that the warring sides went to war just to acquire the bodies of their enemy to feast upon. To the people of the underground abandoned cities, these months, that seemed to drag on like a car with no tires being towed along the road, were known as the months of starving terror. Eventually, however, one side would have to triumph over the other, and that side was the Kadeshi. As the situation had unfolded across the rest of the system, resupplies to the core of Urialtith became less and less frequent until ceasing entirely. Meaning that the world-bound Kadeshi and the children of the Ep3 were on an even playing field. Unlike the Ep3, the Kadeshi were able to unify for a time, pushing back, defeating, killing, and eating the biological parts of the cyborg Kodo, ending the fighting for a time. But it wasn't to last. Even with the Kodo defeated, the Kadeshi would fracture into hundreds of gangs again. Thousands of civil wars were fought across the tunnels and the bunkers in broken cities. Horrific techniques were used across the artificial warrens of the world. Things like superheated molten nanobots, basically just sentient lava, was poured down chutes and pipelines. Likewise, traps were laid. Things like fake tunnels that when you walked into them would release either poison gas, spikes from the walls, lava from the ceiling, little hunter-killer wasp droids, or a combination, and rabid robotic creatures which were juiced up with scrap code and Noblin rage discs to really bring out their inner berserker. Along with the carnage of war, the curse of cannibalism continued throughout the caverns. A group of Kadeshi decided that even the surface was better than the state that the underground had devolved to. These 60 souls banded together into the surface crawlers. They built a caravan of vehicles, drove across the surface. Looking out to the world, it was still burning. Ignited debris rained tumbling from the sky. The sky was blood red with swirling wispy mint-green patches. They deployed their caravan upon the surface and set out to escape the insanity of the below cities. Their fate is unknown, but it can be assumed that they either died from starvation, infighting, or some other unknown means. The Kadeshi population began to shrink rapidly until there was only 2 left. These 2 fought viciously, punching, beating, bleeding, and feasting. These 2 Kadeshi, whose names were unknown, eventually killed each other, bashing each other's head in at the same time with one last singular motion. It was the end of the shattered hunger of the below cities and the 2 last Kadeshi on the world. But it wouldn't be the end of their souls. All the souls that had suffered in the months of starving terror and the shattered hunger of the below cities coalesced in the flare abyss with the death of the last 2 Kadeshi. Their merged souls created the flare spawn called Karidekamphian, a demon that still exists today. Needless to say, the shattered hunger of the below cities was one of the most horrifying parts of the Greater War. The next planet to enter the fray was the world of Neaolebeth, a 5-layered flat world that was made sometime roughly 200,000 to 150,000 years ago. The population of the world was one of the most dense in the system, roughly 610 billion. The megastructure was mainly an agricultural world which supplied the majority of the food to the next most inner gigastructure, the asteroid Sohn Ring. Now with this specific world, the Kodo didn't want to completely destroy it. That would render it completely useless, besides rebuilding it all from the ground up. So the Kodo devised a different way to take over the structure. The plan was to kidnap a group of Kadeshi and scan their DNA. Once the DNA was scanned and secured, the Kodo would 3D print puppet Kadeshi which could be remotely controlled by Psychotechnian artisans. Using these puppets, the Kodo would integrate into society on Neaolebeth and slowly climb up the ranks until they controlled all positions of power. Once they were in those positions, they would begin to spread misinformation about the allegiance of the asteroid Sohn Ring, telling the citizens of Neaolebeth that they had joined the children of the Psychotechniat. In turn, the major agricultural suppliers of the ring would cease shipments to the gigastructure, starving them out. The plan was enacted on 7th of Capricorn and 9.315. Luckily for the Kodo, the plan worked flawlessly and shipments from Neaolebeth to the asteroid Sohn Ring ceased on the 41st of Opharian. With the people of the agricultural megastructure firmly under control of a shadow government, the Kodo considered their job on that world done, and the invasion of the next perfectly set up. It's probably worth mentioning what the asteroid Sohn Ring, or just ASR for short, even is. The ASR is a gigastructure in the Mense system which is comprised of millions, maybe even billions, of medium to large asteroids all interlaced with interconnective green steel tunnels, walkways, and Julian rings, a megastructure consisting of tens or even hundreds of O'Neill cylinders connected together in a ring, which gave the asteroid belt the look of rope made from fishing wire-thin strings. It housed a population of 13 quadrillion. The inhabitants of this ring, as said before, were fed by the layered agricultural flat world of Neaolebeth. But now that the Kodo had secretly infiltrated the world, the ASR was no longer receiving food. This mass starvation on the scale of quadrillions lasted for 4 years and played out much the same as the months of starving terror on Urialtith. However, this time there was also the pressure of a Kodo invasion. The Kadeshi of the ASR didn't last long. It only took a year to force a surrender. In the end, the vast majority of the Kadeshi who inhabited the ring decided that it was a better idea to peacefully end the conflict in their habitat. A cloned body of Admiral Kiliaratas, called Kiliaratas Inferior, which was basically just a fully robotic puppet that the real Kiliaratas could remotely pilot, was deployed to the ring. It, as well as an entourage of children of the Psychotechniat, signed the Treaty of Sohn Surrender with the 800 Kadeshi who governed the ASR. The signing of this treaty made the asteroid Sohn Ring a client state under the children of the Psychotechniat. Even with this client state status, however, the starvation of the quadrillions of souls would continue for years to come. With the surrender of the asteroid Sohn Ring, the theater of the outer system would come to a close. Now, it was only the 3 planets of the inner system, Yin Yang Das 1 and 2, and Mense-Prime itself. Hope you enjoyed the video, plenty more on the way. Once again, don't forget to unlike and disubscribe from the channel, and you bloody better tune into the next one or I'll steal your bathroom sink.